Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Cordillera Del Fuego A16 Anaerobic honey processed Costa Rica from the Picky Chemist. And there's the bag right there. And the Picky Chemist, based out of Chaudfontaine, Belgium. And this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished 4th place out of 4 Picky Chemist coffees on that day. This is also part 1 of our 4-part Picky Chemist series that will feature the 4 coffees from that blind taste test video. And if you watched that video, then I don't think it came as a big surprise that this coffee was my least favorite from the 4 coffees on that table, given the processing method. So it'll be interesting to see if it remained that way, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, it's always a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to these heavier processed coffees. The Picky Chemist as a whole definitely roasts on the lighter side of the spectrum, maybe not quite as light as some of the super light coffee roasters like Apollon's Gold that we've reviewed on this channel, but still a little bit lighter than something like Rose that we have also recently reviewed. Relative to the other coffees that we're reviewing in this series, this one felt like it maybe had a little bit more development to it given the processing method, but even then it's still on the very light side by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 31, first impression, and it was that blind taste test rankings day, and the cup had a near vicious spice-like attribute to it as it was super cinnamon forward, and that definitely helped us detect which coffee it was, given that Costa Rican coffees have had this cinnamon-like quality to them for a couple of years now. It did offer a moderate amount of clarity and a slight fermentiness as well, kind of contrasting notes right there, but on the other side of things, it was slightly bitter in terms of the florality and okay start. And what I mean by still offering a fair bit of clarity as well as the fermentiness is I think it came out a little bit more clean than I was initially expecting. Given the processing method, even then there was a slight bit of fermentiness attributed to that processing method. We continue on to day 33 as we ran it through the Chemex, and it did continue to offer a slightly cleaner cup relative to the expectations for it. There was the lively spice quality to it yet again throughout the entirety of the cup, and a slight bitterness as well as a red berry fermentiness with an extremely cinnamon forward cup. Yet again, not too much of a change based off of the brew methods, but we continue on to day 36 as we ran it through the April brewer, and it was pretty similar to the Chemex day as it continues to remain on the slightly cleaner side of things relative to expectations, but still very direct and distinct cinnamon quality to it. The entire cup continues to radiate these sweeter spice components in general with a slight fermenty berry quality to it as well. So it's been very consistent on these first couple of days, even with the different brew methods. But we continue on to day 38 where we did make some adjustments, higher temperatures, a little bit more fine of a grind. And the cup was weirdly a little bit more toned down and well-rounded altogether. The cinnamon is very much present, but in a more subtle aspect as opposed to what was initially a little bit overbearing. It does open up a lot in this robust cinnamon chocolate cake aspect as it did cool down, so I wasn't necessarily enjoying that part as much, and that's one of the reasons I did settle on some lower temperatures in the future. But day 40 attempted the same adjustments with the Chemex, and it was very consistent in the sense that it was heavily dominated by the cinnamon qualities to it. If you watched that blind taste test video, then I said that my big concern with this coffee was that it might be a little too one note for me, that it might continue to remain too cinnamon spice forward for me. And unfortunately, up to this point, even with the adjustments I've made, it has continued to remain that way, which has been a little frustrating at times. It does have a strong complementary chocolate as well, less clarity, less evenness to the cup all around, so not necessarily my favorite today. Attempted the same thing again through the V60, and this is when I just kind of settled on I'm going to go back to our original recipe on this one because it's at this time focused a little bit more on the fermenty red fruit, and it was a little bit different in general as it had the encompassing cinnamon attribute to it, but maybe not necessarily as direct as it had been on the previous days. This time it was that slightly more fermenty aspect that was ruling the cup, so as a result it wasn't an ideal shift. It felt a little bit more heavy than I'd experienced. So day 45 went back to that original recipe, and it left that same initial impression. It is interesting, I did receive this coffee at that day 31 mark, so I didn't necessarily expect it to change too much, and honestly, it didn't change that much with the exception of the adjustments we made. But even with the adjustments we made, it really just kind of changed in one direction or the other, but for the most part continued to remain those two strong qualities. either that slightly fermenty red fruit or the cinnamon-like component to it. So not necessarily great. Complimentary chocolate yet again. At this time I described it as being reminiscent of M&M's with a bit of the red fermentiness and a slight herbality. It's been consistent at the very least, so that's a theme I can say for that day 45 mark. Day 47, final day, again, same temperatures on this one, and it kept the cup slightly more even at this time. So I've said that on previous days. It continues to remain just even in general. That's going to be a little bit of a theme throughout a lot of these videos with the Picky Chemist, but it does remain a little bit more on that strong spice aspect to the cup right at the forefront, more of that red fruit and herbality on the back end as well. So a lot of these notes a little bit repetitive, maybe on one day a little bit more dominant in one area, but for the most part, pretty consistent cup all around. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 5s. So let's go through those real quick. And we will start with the finish level 5. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anybody. It has a very strong cinnamon-like finish to the cup. Even on days where that was a little bit more toned down, it still felt very long lasting. So it's something that I'm not too surprised to see reach that level 5 mark. And then the spice, level 5, as I always like to say, it's not necessarily spicy in terms of like hot spice, but rather just the spice-like quality to the cup. Yes, right at the first impression, I had a very strong cinnamon attribute to this one, and that was consistent throughout. And no matter how I made this coffee, it was something that you were definitely picking up from this one, so I could definitely see that being there at that level 5. There's some other sweet spices to it, but that's the one that really seemed to be highlighted the most within this coffee, so definitely think that justifies the level 5. A couple of level 4s. We'll start with the sweetness level 4. Yes, very sweet coffee. I don't think that's surprising either, given that the cinnamon was right at the forefront. I think the other thing they have listed on here is something like brown sugar. Even then, the fruit component within this one was also pretty sweet, so that right there definitely justified at that level 4. Chocolate level 4. Yes, I don't think they had anything like that listed on here. Maybe something like a vanilla, which would make sense because there was a slight kind of bitterness to the cup in general. But for me, it was reminiscent of both chocolate cake at times as well as M&M's, but I really like that M&M note I had listed towards the end, given that it felt quite well defined, if anything. A bunch of level 3s. We will start with the savoriness level 3. I did kind of mention this herbal aspect that was present within it, and I think it also did go a little bit in line with the spice quality that was present within this coffee, so that's kind of interesting how high that scored. Body level 3, that part I don't think is surprising whatsoever, given that in the processing method, the origin, and the brew method we went with for this coffee. Cleanliness level 3, I think I was being a little bit generous when it came to that. I do have to say that relative to anaerobic honey processed coffees, this one is definitely on the cleaner side of those. And it did have a very defined profile to it. I mean, it's kind of hard to score anything lower than a 3 when the cinnamon quality in this cup is that well defined. So I think that the level 3 is probably the best place to put it, but it's definitely not the cleanest coffee. It definitely has a fair bit of the fermenty quality to it. Acidity level 3, that was an interesting one. This coffee wasn't quite as bright as I think I might have been expecting, especially given the roast profile of this coffee. So not necessarily a ton of brightness. I think it was still on the higher side of level 3, but not to the same extent that justified that level 4 mark. Berry fruit level 3. Yes, while I've mentioned the red berry fermentiness to it, I think that the reason it didn't score higher was because it was a little overpowered by that spice attribute to the cup. So I'm fine with that being there at that level 3, as well as the citrus, which is something I haven't discussed too much in this review, but it's another quality that was felt maybe in a little bit more moderation and maybe a little bit more inconsistently than the other key attributes within this one. I feel like that justifies the level 3, and then we have a couple of level 2s, but for the most part, I don't think any of those are necessarily worth mentioning. I feel like this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I don't think it will come as a big surprise to anybody that this one was my least favorite of the 4 Picky Chemist coffees that we are reviewing, and it did fall in line with that expectation that I had both when I purchased this coffee as well as after I tried it for the first time. I had huge concerns that it would be a little too skewed in one direction. That's what ended up happening with this one, as I couldn't necessarily shake the very strong spice, cinnamon spice-like quality to it. I don't think this coffee was intended to go in any other direction, honestly. I don't think this coffee was ever meant to be the most complex coffee. I think it was meant to kind of give you a very specific and well-defined flavor, which it did. The coffee still remained pretty even. That's something I wanted to give the Picky Chemist credit for, both that as well as the consistency, as well as a slight evenness, as well as a overall clarity that was probably a little better than I might have expected for the processing method. So there are some positives to be picked up from this coffee. I can just tell that this one wasn't my coffee, and it wasn't my coffee going into it. It wasn't my coffee the first time I tried it, and it didn't end up necessarily being my favorite coffee. I definitely like the other three that we are going to be discussing from the Picky Chemist a fair bit more than this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I've been thinking about this for quite a while because I'm not entirely sure. I actually love cinnamon, and I do like sweeter spice. I mean, this has some things that in theory I feel like I should like, but I'm not entirely sure I can necessarily recommend it to somebody that really likes cinnamon, because even then, as somebody that loves cinnamon in general, I can be a little put off by this coffee at times, especially with just how strong the quality is in this one. So I feel like the best way I can direct somebody for this coffee is somebody that likes their really intense coffees, because this one had some great intensity. I mean, has a long lasting finish, has a high amount of sweetness, has some very strong flavor profiles to it in general. Not necessarily the cleanest, but still above average in terms of that clarity. Still lighter profiled in general, so a combination of those things might make it an interesting coffee, an interesting just experience for some people that may have not had some of these Costa Rican coffees that have these very strong cinnamon qualities to it. But I think that's kind of the best way I can direct somebody for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Cordillera Del Fuego A16 Anaerobic honey processed Costa Rica from the Picky Chemist. Thank you for watching.